Hi, Dr. Pulsifer here to discuss something that may be a little esoteric, but that you really ought to think about when you're deciding what sort of combat methods to use in your games. And that is the difference between independent and dependent combat results. So these are two major categories of combat resolution applied at two different levels. It refers to whether the nature of the enemy force makes any immediate difference to the attacker. At the overall level, the big battle level, which I call the macro level, the question is, does the relative and absolute size of the two forces matter? You would think it should, but in many cases it does not. In independent combat it does not. At the individual or micro level, do the characteristics of the defenders matter to the attack? You can have games where the combat is macro, independent, and micro dependent, or vice versa. So you can mix them together. Sometimes where you draw the lines here can get a little bit hairy or fuzzy. Let's talk first about independent combat. In independent combat, how you do does not depend on the size or the success of the other side. So one unit has the same chance of doing damage whether it faces one enemy or a dozen, and whether the enemy successfully kill that unit or not. The combat may depend on something like a defense rating or terrain advantages, but not on how well the other side does in the attack. So there are two independent attacks, in other words. Two dice rolls if you're using dice. And that's why it's called independent, because they're independent attacks. Now in the independent micro combat, then the defensive qualities of the defender make no difference in the attack. So armor, dodging, etc. are not accounted for. And once again, both sides, if both sides get to attack, they're two dice rolls. You can have situations where only one side can attack and the other side just has to take it. Suffer. Independent makes more sense on a large scale of armies than on a small scale of individuals. But even in games where the macro combat is independent, like Britannia, where you roll a 5 or a 6 and you hit an enemy army no matter how many you're fighting, the micro combat can be somewhat dependent. For example, in Britannia, you take terrain into account, and if the defending target is a Roman or a cavalry, you need to roll a 6 instead of a 5 or a 6. Example, in US Risk, which is independent macro combat, it doesn't matter whether there are 40 defenders or 4 defenders. The attack is exactly the same as long as the attacker has at least 2 armies. 4 attacking 20 still has the attack advantage. 4 attacking 100 still has the attack advantage. The attacker is more likely to win a particular battle. Does this make sense? No, but it's simple. Now the actual dice rolling in the US version of Risk is dependent because you're comparing the 3 attacker rolls, or up to 3, with the up to 2 defender rolls. Another example, the older versions of Computer Civilization 1 through 4, when 2 armies fought, only the top unit in the stack fought the top unit in the other stack. It didn't matter whether it was 1 unit against 100. It was only the top against the top. Again, that doesn't make much sense, but it's simple. Now in dependent combat, the success definitely depends on the numbers or strength of the other side. And for the macro, and in the micro, it depends on the characteristics of both the attacker and the defender. The most well-known expression of this was the classic Avalon Hill combat results table. For those of you not familiar with that, you'd figure out the odds in a particular attack, 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 1 to 2, whatever. And the idea was you needed at least 3 to 1 to be successful consistently. Even in a 3-to-1 attack, you could get an exchange result where you would lose, as an attacker, as much as the defender lost. But other occasions, you would force them back or you would wipe them out. At 2-to-1, you could lose your entire force. The defender could lose his entire force. Either side could be forced back or there could be an exchange. There was just one die roll, and both sides could be damaged. Both sides could be harmed. Usually when there's 2 die rolls or 2 calculations, the result only harms the opponent. Now, on the other hand, if you think of Dungeons and Dragons, where you take into account the armor class of your target as well as how well your individual character can hit, that is quite dependent. More examples. Britannia macro is completely independent, so is Axis and Allies. It doesn't matter how many enemies there are, you have the same chance of hitting an Axis and Allies. So one unit defending against a bunch should be overwhelmed with no damage, but that's not the way it works, unless somebody adds an extra rule to it. Like I have one game where there's an overwhelming superiority rule. If you outnumber somebody 4-to-1, you just wipe them out. But normally both sides take damage in a fight when it's not so one-sided. Then you have the completely dependent macro combat like the Avalon Hill CRT and a couple of prototypes that I am working on. In this case, both sides roll 1 die for each army in the fight, and whoever has the higher result wins and kills one defending army, and ties go to the defender. Very simple, very quick. Not a wide standard deviation. It's pretty difficult for one army to defeat 2 armies, but it can happen occasionally. And then you have lots of mixed methods. RTS video games are generally epitomes of firepower, and what matters is the attacker's firepower and the defender's armor or hit points. And Civilization as well. The one-on-one is independent, even though overall it's independent. Now, let's think in terms of strategic level and tactical level. For macro combat, the size of the enemy force, it's more likely that you're going to have independent attacks tactically and dependent attacks strategically. And for micro combat, it's the other way around. You're more likely to be dependent tactically and independent strategically. Took me a while to figure this slide out, and I hope I've got it right. Read it over, think about it, it makes sense. Now, there's no formula to help you decide which of these methods to use. Independent is definitely simpler, but I have to confess I really dislike something like the way Risk ignores the effects of mass, which is one of the principles of war, mass.